I want to talk a little bit about how to officially start a nonprofit organization. And so that doesn't mean necessarily how to actually achieve the purpose. It doesn't necessarily mean what that programming that nonprofit will do looks like. I'm going to be talking about the actual nuts and bolts of the filings required at the state level and the application required with the IRS to officially form and then receive tax exemption for a nonprofit organization. So, I mentioned the state level. That's going to be the first step. It is pretty confusing to most people, but there are sort of two ways to look at your nonprofit organization. There's going to be the paperwork you file with the state that actually gives you a corporation. And so that's certainly confusing to people when I talk to them about this because a corporation is traditionally a for-profit business entity, right? Well, there is such thing as a non-stock corporation, and that's the type of corporation that actually underlies the nonprofit formation and then ultimately the tax exemption that that non-stock corporation receives. So, kind of a complicated way of saying you file at the state level to receive the actual entity that will become your tax-exempt nonprofit organization. So after you filed at the state level, you do have to do a few things that are pretty much required of any corporation, but particularly important to do for a nonprofit because when you get to the IRS application, those are called a 1023 application for tax exemption. That application will require that you've taken a few of these steps after you form at the state level. So, some of those steps are going to include putting a board of directors together and then holding your first board meeting. Now, it's really important that you have that first board meeting because when you go through this process to put together and ultimately file the tax exempt application, which, by the way, that's a 50 to 100 page application and it can take 4, 6, 8 months for the IRS to approve that application. And so you're probably thinking, well, what do I do in the how do I handle donations? And during that period, I'm waiting for that application. What do I do? Well, that's why it's so important to hold that first board meeting because all of the donations and any of the conduct that you do between that first board meeting over here and then that approval for tax exemption over here, maybe 8 months later, all of that in between is going to be retroactively tax exempt from the date of that board meeting. So, obviously then, important to have that first board meeting as soon as you can and then get that application filed as soon as you can to try to move everything along. So, file with the state, hold your first board meeting, and then you move into working on your 1023 application. Now, there's two types of 1023 applications out there. There's the long form, just the form 1023, and then there's the 1023 EZ, which is actually a substantially shorter and less expensive filing fee form for tax exemption. It's got some limitations on it, and I can get into the details of that in my videos that are actually specific to these types of 1023s, but real quickly, it's going to be limiting on how much donation revenue you can receive in your first 3 years, each year in your first 3 years. What does that mean? Well, with a 1023 EZ application, you have to, in good faith, guarantee that you will not receive more than $50,000 in donation revenue each of your first 3 years. Now, obviously, no one has a crystal ball, and that could change, and you could end up with like 100,000 or maybe millions in one of the years. And that's fine. It could trigger an audit from the IRS, which, as long as you're squeaky clean otherwise, no big deal, just kind of a pain for you to go through. But the 1023 full form application has no restrictions like that. And that's also why it's much lengthier. It's a lot more information that you have to provide, a lot more plans and forecasts for revenue and all types of things that go into what the IRS wants to analyze to determine whether or not you should receive tax exemption. And remember, this is no easy decision for them, mainly because of the fact that tax exemption means no taxes. And guess what? That's how our government makes money. So they are going to be definitely scrutinizing your application, and they are very stringent and narrow with what they want to let through. It has to have a charitable, education, or scientific purpose. Those are kind of the broad purposes that you would have for your nonprofit organization. And so they look at that, all the information you provide, and then they decide whether or not to give you tax exemption under, let's say, 501c3, 501c4, or 501c6. Those are all Internal Revenue Code sections. 501c3 is going to be most likely a public charity, meaning all of your revenue and donations come from the public. Sometimes it can be a private foundation, meaning there's a limited sort of private source of funding. 501c4 is going to be a politically motivated organization, works on lobbying and works with candidates. And a 501c6 is going to be a business league, which is a collection of like businesses that work together and try to improve their profession. So getting back to the application process, you file with the state, you've had your first board meeting, and now you're working on that 1023 application. Like I said, there's a lot that goes into that, but once you get all of that information put into your 1023 application, narrative of your programming, who's going to be the board of directors, who's going to get paid, what the goal is, all these things. Once you get that done, you mail that off to the IRS. It's got a pretty fat filing fee, but once you mail that off, then it's wait time. You got to wait, like I said, 4, 6, 8 months. And then ultimately, they're either going to send you a notice saying we need more information, and then you just provide whatever that information is. And then usually, once you provide that additional information, they actually issue your exemption within a couple months. If they don't request anything additional, it's probably still going to be a couple more months. And then ultimately, hopefully, they'll issue your tax exemption. Now, I said earlier in the video that they have to be really stringent and really narrow with what they let in. And that's true. However, in the last few years, they've actually taken a number of the IRS agents that deal with the analysis and approval of applications, and they've moved them to the Audit Committee. And so what that means, most likely, is that it is a little bit easier to get through with your application, assuming that everything is on the up and up, of course, but there may be a higher opportunity or a higher chance of audit if you're doing anything with your nonprofit that looks a little bit unusual for whatever reason. And it's important to mention that with nonprofits, a lot of the things that they want to do are unconventional, and they have a lot of regulation and restriction, so sometimes things will look funky even if they're not actually funky or illegal. So don't be too scared of that audit. It's not always a bad thing, but know that it's not easy to get your application approved. It might be a little bit easier nowadays, but you got to run your nonprofit squeaky clean, document everything, hold those board meetings, because there may be an increased chance of audit. Now, to wrap this video up, I want to cover the follow-up steps that you need to do after you receive your tax exemption. So once you've received your tax exemption, whichever state you're in, it's most likely that you'll have a few more filings that you need to do. For instance, in California, you have to file the CT1 and the 3500A. These are filed with the Attorney General and with the Franchise Tax Board, even though you're not taxed, and both of these are really just to say, hey, government office, here's who we are, here's what we're doing, we received our tax exemption from the IRS, and now you have us in your database, and so you can track us and we can file our tax reporting at the end of the year, and so on. So, to recap it all, file with the state, hold your first board meeting, file your 1023 application. When you receive your IRS determination letter in the mail, go back to the state and file in California your CT1 and your 3500A. Now, again, long process. This can be anywhere from 5, 6 months to a year, so make sure that you have that runway and you understand that process. And of course, the more you can get in line and get in order for all of these pieces of filings, the quicker and the better it's going to go. So, hope this was helpful. Hope you now are an expert on how to form your nonprofit. Have a good day.